So we're going to be talking a lot about virtue, because that's what every bad Catholic needs to hear about. So I figured we could start off praying to the one Catholic who could never be considered bad and got all this virtue stuff right, so that we can ask the Virgin Mother to help us open our hearts and minds to benefit from this class. So if you join me, in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Ghost. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou amongst women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners now and at the hour of our death. Amen. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Ghost. Amen. Well, with each of these classes, I'd like to start off a little bit and give reasoning behind why I do these things, why I choose the classes I do. And Bad Catholics, anything sounds like a provocative enough title to get some people interested in what they were doing. Like some of you were saying, you felt like maybe you would be good at teaching this class. I think all of us at some point need to feel like maybe we've just been bad enough to give pointers to those coming after us. John Zmirak, who writes these books, and they're all colorful and sort of fun. John Zmirak, I don't want to, it's hard to throw down the label of Chestertonian on anyone. That's quite a feat to accomplish, and John Zmirak's still young, so we shouldn't unduly, throw a millstone around his neck that he doesn't yet deserve. But John Zmirak is sort of Catholic in the Chesterton model. By that I mean really quick with wit and the little smart jab, not only against his opponents, but primarily against himself. If you did read any of these books, A Bad Catholic's Guide to Good Living, I got the other two here. I got this from one of my good friends the day I became Catholic. Bad Catholic's Guide to Good Living, which is mostly about liturgies and festivals. Then A Bad Catholic's Guide to Wine, Whiskey, and Song, which is a sort of dictionary A through Z of alcoholic beverages Catholics came up with. Now will feature significantly in what we talk about. And then finally, The Bad Catholic's Guide to the Seven Deadly Sins, which is going to be our guidepost. Now, like I said, I'll be honest, John Zmirak can be rather smart-alecky and pointed, and he doesn't mince words, a lot like Chesterton. Sometimes I think we will read back on people and think that humor was gentler until you actually start finding out what Old English words mean. And then you realize Chesterton can throw a jab at the best of them. I'm going to get it wrong, but he debated his whole life Shaw, but I forget what Shaw it is.
George Bernard. Yeah,
George. And one of his famous sayings was, "George is like the Venus de Milo. What there is of him is wonderful. But the implication is that a lot of him is missing, including his brain." That was the jab. So, what I like best about these, though, is if you know John Zmirak's life at all, and he very much wants to fill you in on it, his love of beagles, the fact he grew up in Hell's Kitchen, part Irish, part Czechoslovakian, all sorts of details he could fill into your life that we won't necessarily get in here. But I think he does a good modeling job of, if we take a good, hard look at ourselves, God is going to be easy on us at the end of time. And it seems like he's being flippant sometimes, self-deprecating in fact. But I really think the Benedictine monks, and if you look at the rule of St. Benedict, there's a general line of this as well. If you're willing to take a good, hard look at yourself, you're going to find out that you're probably a more harsh judge than God ever intends to be. And if we're willing to do that, and with levity, not just gauge ourselves, but really be willing to laugh at ourselves. I mean, I'm sure you've had confessors who told you, now this sin is gone, don't hold on to it anymore. Holding on to the sin that you confessed would be just as bad as committing it. I hope this course gives us a good lesson in that. How to look at ourselves, laugh about it, and move on in a more positive direction. So, I don't mean to implicate anyone's a bad Catholic, except myself. Hopefully you'll follow my examples. So what are we going to base this on? This is a morality class. This really, I want to center on the virtues. Because what does every bad Catholic need to know how to do? Well, they need to know how to become like Christ. And Christ, of all things, was virtuous. Virtuous in his humanity, not by simply being part of the Godhead, not simply being incarnate God, but because his humanity was perfectly in line with God the Father. Why is the Sacred Heart such a significant symbol to the Catholic faith? But because this heart that wills, as we've always understood, the heart is what makes us decide to do things. Jesus Christ's human heart was in complete conformity to the heart of God, God the Father himself. And how we have a heart like God is to have the virtues. And a lot of times when we get morality taught as a class, we focus on the virtues. And the virtues are really easy to categorize, write down, think about, I need to be more temperate, or whatever it may be. John Zmirak, funny enough, focuses on the 7 deadly sins, which he says we're all really good at. We're all really good at. And then when we try to do something about having the 7 deadly sins that we're all naturally prone to be good at, it's not that we usually get into the realm of virtue, but we usually counter vice with neurosis, which means, of course, going too far the other way. Catholicism, very pointedly, does not think of the moral life as two extremes. Any sort of idea about life as two extremes is heretical, and it does not fall into the Catholic faith. Our world is not simply divided into the good seeds and the bad seeds, fighting an eternal war. This is called Manichaeism. I'm not even going to tempt you to write it down on the board. I don't want you to try to misspell it. But Manichaeism is the idea that there are two gods or two principles that rule life. One totally good, the other totally bad. Usually the bad stuff is flesh and bodily things and the material creation. And the good stuff is all spiritual. God, thoughts, math, etc. And the idea is that the good and the bad things fight it out, and they're polar opposites. And by the way, if you take more than one class with me, you're going to hear me repeat not only ideas but jokes. And it's probably because I don't have a good memory, but I like to say it's because the jokes are so good. But you decide. But this is an essential point. I made it in Tuesday's class, and I make it again today. It is wrong to think that the reason the bad or the evil is evil and different than good is because it's its polar opposite. Evil is always parasitic of the good. And the reason why it's difficult to do the good and not the evil is because the worst evils try their best to look like the good. And so it's not simple enough for me to say, you know what? You shouldn't be a glutton. Don't be a glutton. Stay away from food. You'll be fine. Because it's funny enough, we can destroy our souls going the opposite way. And it's funny, right? In our culture, everybody's obsessed with food. They're just either eating too much of it or doing too much about it to avoid it. And that's one of the things that John Zmirak will bring up. Food is the easy one. It seems like we're all obsessed with food, either how much we can shovel into our mouths or what weight loss program that we can spend a lot of money on, to be obsessed with food in just a different way. And so classically what this is we have virtues, we have their vices, but then we have the way in which we can overshoot the virtue. And that's what we mean by neurosis. So chastity is what we all should strive for. Lust is the easiest way to violate chastity. But frigidity has its own destructive properties to our souls. Patience is the virtue, wrath the vice, but servility is just as bad. And we go on with all of these, the 7 deadly sins, the virtues that oppose them, and the neurosis, which is our too strident of a response to them. And what we're really going to do with this class, if you notice there's 7 deadly sins and we have 6 classes, we're probably going to have to double up one of these times. But I want to try to go through some of these, and using John Zmirak's books, try to get a good read. on not only how we respond from some of the things that are easy for us to do, like what we'll talk about today, sloth, but how we shouldn't mistake diligence for fanaticism. All right, now hopefully that's the most boring part of all the lectures, but I want to stop and ask if anybody has any questions about the sort of structure. This is a very ancient structure of Catholic morality. Just want to make sure people sort of understand what we're talking about. As far as individual words and stuff, we'll get there when we get to the appropriate lecture. But do we understand how it works in general? Okay. So today, we're going to deal with sloth. And what we're not going to do is sit here and try to lob bullets at any particular people and say, this is not trying to be self-help. This is trying to, in a humorous way, talk about what we all know about ourselves a little too well. So I don't want to completely be anchored to the book the whole time, but sometimes he just needs to be read. So the joy of sloth is what he calls this first part. First of all, the word slothful is offensive. The polite term is inertful. There are millions of inerto-Americans, and the only reason they haven't raised up their voices till now is, well, why attract attention? If you put up your hand, you might get called on. Then the teacher will know just how much of the reading you really did. No reason to ruin his day. In fact, it's just uncharitable. Studying, okay, skimming the Gospels, the inertful man can appreciate that Jesus means well, but wonders just how well he appreciates human nature. When Christ says that the creator of the universe numbers all the hairs on our heads, the natural response is, enough with the bald jokes. I have a hard time just reading my Dish Network bill to figure out if they're ripping me off or not. So in matters religious, there are certain fundamental questions that vex each human soul. Each of us has a governing passion, a distinctive thorn in our spirit or flesh. And those of us who dwell in that mild middle state we call inertia have our own question, which is asked not so much of God but of ourselves. Is it really worth it? And so this essential question, is it all worth it? Is it worth it to do? And so he throws out some essential questions, for instance. Is it really worth it to brown your sandwich in a skillet when the microwave can do it all in a minute? Is it really essential to train the church choir to sing anything but hymns from the 1970s? Is it necessary or worth it to put on a tie or shave your legs for Mass? Is it worth it to iron clothes, to repeat mind-numbing prayers? As he says, once you've hailed Mary once, why do it again? To go to Mass, to fast, to pray a single time more than the absolute requirement you read about? Why make the extra effort? Why make the extra effort to do anything at all? And so he makes the point, and this is a frightening point with the day that I figured this out. We all want things to be easy. That's not condemning anyone particularly. But he makes the point that what will heaven be like? What will heaven be like? And if you start to dream of heaven and think of what heaven will be like, and you start to see or hear yourself being irritated at the description of heaven, you know there's something to improve upon. And so he says, imagine what the schedule in heaven will be like every day. You wake up and you praise the immortal God. And then supposedly there's a break. And then you get back together and you praise the immortal God. And there's a break for lunch. And then you get back from lunch and you praise the immortal God. Afternoon break, get back together, praise the immortal God before dinner. After dinner, file back in, praise the immortal God, go to sleep, and as he says, ad infinitum, literally. I was asked by my Protestant parents, what do you do when you go down to the monastery? Because I go down to a monastery, the Benedictine monastery in Oklahoma. What do you do all day down there? And I say, well, they pray. They go, what else? Well, they pretty much just pray. My aunt asked the same thing. What do you do at the monastery when you go down? You're like, well, you pray with them. You know, when they go do something else, you Walk around and contemplate, I guess. And I've often heard people say, that just sounds boring. It sounds boring to just go down and pray. And I try to hold my tongue and not be a bad person and go, what do you think heaven will be like? What do you think heaven will be like? What are we going to do in heaven but worship God? And that starts to be the difficulty in looking at any of these virtues and deciding how we improve our life. It's real easy to think about the virtue in terms of how it will definitively help you or improve some aspect of your life. Will it make you a happier person? Will it make you get along with better people? When we think about it in terms of what heaven will be like and how we're trying to acclimate ourselves to eternally worshiping God, things get a little bit more difficult. And so he's making a sort of joke here. How many of us want to put off simple things that could easily be accomplished in a very short time? How many of us have clothes waiting for us to wash right now? How many of us have dishes waiting for us to wash right now? How many of us have work assignments, school assignments, the lawn, someone we should talk to, a phone call to make? And so it starts to, he's actually trying to be nice to the slothful person. Because one of the difficult things about life is that there's just one more thing to do. Just one more thing to do. The difficult thing about heaven is there's one thing to do always. One thing to do always. But he doesn't let this, he doesn't just want to point out people who we call lazy. And it's important to think that sloth is not just about laziness. All of us at some point want to take it easy and take a break. But what he wants to call, what he calls sloth in drag, or sloth in clothes that doesn't look like sloth, actually starts to bite a little more into our modern lives. He said it would be easy to toss off sloth as a sin that affects only the lazy. But there's another and subtler form it takes, which occurs among the busiest workaholics that we have. And so he brings up the song that I know you've all heard by Harry Chapin, that the cat's in the cradle. I don't want to sing it, it will get in your head. In fact, he actually apologizes because that will be in your head all day now. But the idea is, son, I would have spent more time with you, but I had to work. And then, of course, what happens at the end of the song? He's retired. He calls, hey, son, I'd love to see you. And he goes, Dad, I'm busy. I have to work. The boy grew up just like him. And to bring this point up, to make what he's going to go into, is he says, think about how in the 1970s, we invented all sorts of stuff to do to waste our time. So he says the 1970s did things like invented jogging, streaking, mood rings, biorhythm calculators, CB radios, roller disco, pet rocks, anti-disco rallies, hair metal, neoconservatism, cocaine, and the other bad things that literally their only point is to kill time. And so you start to think about what everybody calls kids these days. Kids these days. And it's funny because I've taught, grading papers in English departments or teaching philosophy, and you get teachers together and they start talking about how lazy kids are. And it's always hilarious hearing that from a graduate student who sleeps until like 1 in the afternoon every day. Because I'm telling you, you look at 6-year-olds through 18-year-olds, they have no time for anything anymore. They're going to violin practice, they're going jogging, they're at the Y, they've got debate, they've got this, that, or the other, and we try to jam-pack their schedule as full as we can. And so if you heard the first part of this essay and you were hearing about sloth, it's easy if you're a go-getter to say, well, then this doesn't apply to me. It's easy to do this with all of the 7 deadly sins, to say, oh, I'm not the slothful type, I'm going to tune out. But what John Zmirak wants to point out is that there's a sloth that's even more insidious, and it's being slothful in things that matter most. Slothful in things that matter most. When is the only time that you get busy doing things? Usually when something else is due. So, I always hear this from the kids. When do they have a flurry of Facebook activity? When do they clean their room? When do they call mom? The day a paper's due. So that's the best time to avoid doing the paper When do we all of a sudden get energy to do anything but what's required of us? And it's when it's coming up. And so we go back to this image of heaven and a job that we will do for eternity, and we realize that we have an ever-pressing obligation to try to be a friend of God. To try to be a friend of God. And when we do that, that's what makes the workaholic decide, you know what's easier than getting right with God? You know what's easier than working on my relationship with my spouse? You know what's easier than my kids? You know what's easier than all sorts of the most important things in life? 100 less important things. 100 less important things. I wait every day I come to work in the morning, people are jogging in my neighborhood. Every time I go back for lunch, people are jogging in my neighborhood. Every time I come back from lunch, people jogging over lunch. Every time I drive back after 5 o'clock, people jogging in the neighborhood. And I don't want to pick on joggers just because I clearly don't jog. But I think that jogging, all these people running around town, you just could imagine a traveler, time traveler from the past, and they'd come up and they'd go, "Where are you going? Where are you heading off to in such haste?" And joggers would all say, "Well, nowhere. I'm just jogging." Now, I'm not trying to bash people who are trying to get in shape, but take the metaphor for what it is. Where are you going? I'm just moving. For what purpose? Well, I can come up with, to lose weight, this ideal. But I'm just doing something. And so in our society, if you're not just slovenly lazy in an obvious way, you don't sit on your couch till, the Lifetime reruns you're watching run out, the marathon. It might be that you're doing needless activity to avoid what you need most. John Barrett gives another beautiful example. He says you can tell, it's an inverse proportion, how much people care about the faith to how comfortable their pews are. So he says, if you'll go to all these ancient churches in Italy, for instance, there's no place to sit. And if they do have places to sit, it's rickety old fold-down chairs, or there's no place at all, and you're expected to kneel the whole time. But the altar is encrusted in gold and diamonds. And people would willingly live in very simple houses and give all their money to a church that they might not live to see completed. And you think about all the great cathedrals, all the great churches in Europe, and how long it takes to build those. You realize that a lot of people gave time, money, and effort knowing they'd never see it complete. Knowing they'd never see it complete. We're looking at a painting of our cathedral. I think people are already antsy about it not being done. When's this thing going to be done? I don't know if we've worked on it for a year. People, what's the deal? But it's funny. During the same time period that people started taking money away from making nice palatial churches, houses became little palaces filled with gadgets and comfortable things. The pews became comfortable to sit in. But our modern churches, God bless the souls who raised them up, sometimes lack in an inverse proportion to the way he's pointing this out. So sloth is not just an easy target to point out. It's not just that we find the person who woke up late and we said, "Hey buddy, you need to work on sloth. How about you wake up at 8 and go jogging?" That's not going to be enough to fight sloth. Diligence, of course, is the virtue. Let me see if I can spell right. Diligence is the virtue that we're aiming at. And you do not become diligent just because you wake up early. You do not become diligent just because you're doing stuff. It completely matters what it is you're trying to accomplish. You have to think that a security guard or some soldier keeping post at a gate would exactly be negligent in diligence if they were too active. I don't know about you guys and how many of you have gone hunting, but I remember trying to go hunting with Dad. His dad, he wanted a good manly son. I don't know if it worked out, but, wanted Dad go hunting with him. And diligence when hunting deer is just shutting up and sitting there. And that's hard for a kid to imagine. I think in a kid's mind you're like, aren't we going to go, I don't know what I thought, track the deer? Aren't you going to teach me tricks like, here's a broken, branch. We need to cut it off at the pass. I don't know what you think of when you're a kid. But literally it's sitting there, being quiet, and waiting. It's actually a lot of inactivity. So sloth is the deficiency of diligence, not the deficiency of activity. We are a very active people, and actually the people most active in trying to approach God find that sloth is one of the hardest vices to kick. I don't know if you've ever seen this word. Acedia. But acedia is considered the noonday devil by the monk, the tradition of monks. It's not that it comes and approaches you at the night. It's not that it gets you in difficult times. Acedia is sloth that attacks you right in the middle of doing a good job. This condition entails spiritual weariness, even dreariness, and as often afflicts the most pious or industrious souls partway along their journey towards holiness. Those whose vocation is marriage might know it as the 7-year itch, and every vocation has this attack on it by demons and precisely sloth rearing its head in a very specific way. Instead of keeping our eye on the prize, we start to total up the costs. And so you start living and realizing ugly truths. So for instance, we who are married at age 50, we realize we'll be married to the same person at age 60, and if we keep living, married to the same person at age 70. And we start doing the math and thinking about that prospect. Till the day I turn 65, if you're working, I'll be, for my instance, teaching the same books that I used to love. Why do those bloody monks have to save them from oblivion, he says. You can imagine being a teacher, and there's always the vigor of youth. But after 30 years of reading bad papers over the Iliad, it starts to take its toll. The idea that wherever I'm working, they're just going to bury me in the desk that I'm in. Or maybe stuff you, like a bear. You'll just forever be at your desk stuffed like a stuffed animal. And then he makes a good point about kids. You do realize that this thing that was cute up until a certain age stops being as cute as it used to be and talks back and has its own ideas. And you realize that it's going to keep having its own ideas and keep telling you about them until one of you passes away. And as he says, every parent has that moment where they envy reptiles because they can lay their eggs and scurry away. For you who have kids, it's not as funny, but it'll be funny someday. It's not just the lazy. It's not just the lazy that have to fight against sloth. It's not just the busybodies that are trying to get away, run away from problems. The best among us, the most pious, the people with their sights locked in the best, even sloth will approach them like the noonday devil and start to whisper in their ear, don't you want something different? And you think about in paradise with Adam and Eve. People will always usually want to say that pride was the first sin. We were too proud to listen to God. But there's a way in which, if pride truly is the first sin, all the 7 deadly sins undergird it. And acedia, isn't that one way to explain the problem with Adam and Eve? They have everything they need. But the sly one, the fork-tongued snake, can talk them out of the good deal they have. And we all know either ourselves or friends who've pulled that one, right? They had a perfect thing going. And the reason they just decided to throw it away is because they wanted to do something different. And the hardest thing about this is we look, yet again, at our greatest heroes, Jesus Christ himself in the garden, or tempted in the desert, Job relentlessly being pushed down and feeling that there was no hope for what they were trying to do. John Zmirak points out that the reason that evil and the minions of the devil seem like they have endless energy is because demons know what they're up against. Demons are always ready to help out and make people think that they have a really good reason to keep fighting. So Aquinas warns that acedia, unacknowledged and unanswered, is the sure road to despair. And so now that I've finally depressed you enough, I want you to start thinking, I've turned to what John Zmirak sees as the source of sloth and how we go about rectifying it. And I wouldn't have thought of this, but he says sloth, its source, is simply us trying to get back to the Garden of Eden instead of looking forward to the heaven that Christ has come to establish. And so I think it's a good image, right? We said if you think about heaven, try to imagine heaven and think that some parts of it sound annoying. Praising God every day, won't that get boring? We're usually fond of the nostalgia of Eden. Come on, running around like a really nice nudist colony, but not that type of nudist colony, always food, bacon whenever you want. I'm already salivating, right? This sounds like a great place. And if you look at the church history of what we would be like, preternaturally, if you talk about the state of justice before we fell, human beings sounded, frankly, really awesome, right? They were immortal. They were supposedly impassible. They couldn't get hurt or die. Free from concupiscence. So, as he says, they wouldn't take an all-you-can-eat buffet as a personal challenge. They wouldn't hog both lanes on two-way country roads. Wouldn't look longingly at someone else's spouse or gasp at the results of a pregnancy test. Each child would be a wanted child. They were even free from the small angling towards sin. They'd be free from ignorance, be free from sin, and have lordship over the earth. And he says, what you'll start to notice where this gets the worst is the most idealistic people, the people who are willing to dig grave after grave to make their ideas come true, are precisely the people who are working to make Eden on earth instead of virtuous souls. It's one thing to care about the poor. It's another to be like John Stuart Mill and saying science will eventually cure all means of suffering and everybody will be fine again. That's crazy talk. And how many people are willing to do wretched things in the name of alleviating suffering? We're getting ready to deal within a year a president who his idea of alleviating suffering involves trampling over the religious freedom of the Catholic Church. You don't have to go too far in the past century to look at communist regimes or the Khmer Rouge or fascists who do everything they do in the name of making the world a better place. And you start to think about it, things like the proletarian utopia or the Third Reich or all these names that we start to call the future society we're building, they're just different names for the Garden of Eden. But we're the ones building it again. Sloth, the base of it, is nostalgia for Eden instead of hope for the kingdom of heaven. That's where sloth comes from. Nostalgia for Eden. Acting like we can just be Adam and Eve again. And you think about the laziest person you know, the real drifter or the real free rider. And you start to realize that what they want, they're not bad people. They just want it to be Eden again. Garden of Eden was great. Sure, Adam and Eve were gardeners, but they didn't have to plow. The ground didn't, rise up and curse them. If you believe the TV show The Simpsons, pigs just ran at you, turned over, and bacon was ready. Eden was a freeloader's paradise, if you think about it in a perverted way. And all sin is thinking about a good thing in a perverted way. But then we go to the workaholic, right? The workaholics, Eden is great because there's no big issue confronting us. The hardest thing Adam had to do was name all the animals. I could do that. I've come up with my own name for certain animals. I can't repeat them here, but it's easy. If that's all you had to do, all you have is free time. You don't need to jog to get rid of your mind off of your troubles. There's no troubles. Acedia. Acedia is the thing that creeps even into the Garden of Eden. What are the costs? That's what Adam and Eve ask, right? What is the cost of Eden? Trusting God with the knowledge of good and evil. But that wasn't good enough for us. Sloth gets us all. Zmirak goes on to point out that in our day and age, the easiest way to see this sloth come up is technology. And it's funny how cross-purposes technology really shows us about the sloth in our lives. How many of you recently bought some electronic device to save you time, and it did exactly the opposite?
My boss bought it for me. Does that count?
Yes, that counts completely, right?
I knew it wouldn't save time. I mean, I absolutely knew it was the dumbest thing I'd ever seen, but they spent the money on it.
We just had a meeting about Facebook. It's supposed to save us time with the kids. I'm glad, I'm not bashing Facebook or any sort of technology. It's great, to be able to talk to friends over the internet I have in Great Britain without having to worry about Atlantic hurricanes, on a sailboat over there. I'm not, and Zmirak's not saying that it's not like the Amish don't have sloth. Not true, I was just at Yoder. Plenty of sloth. But what technology, how it bears on us. And anytime we think technology is going to brush away our fundamental problems, is always when it comes back to teach us a lesson. Always about lacking diligence. And you start to think about that, right? I still remember, I think it was my great-granddad complaining about compasses being widely used. That was the technology he was complaining about. He's like, stupid compasses. Now kids can't tell which way north is on their own. And you go like, come on, great-granddad, and tell, except he's right. I'm ashamed about how many times I cannot tell you which direction I'm pointing. And I'm thinking this is only eroding further with each subsequent generation. I mean, I don't even want to think about how many people couldn't find their way back home, but I remember hearing my great-granddad talking about, okay, well, you have to look for, tree limbs that you've broke. This is where I think I got my idea about hunting deer. He would always talk about finding landmarks, tracking a certain way. He was a regular Boy Scout. And now, I don't even know if people really do Boy Scouts anymore, but I shudder to think. I think they probably have, a GPS section, the Facebook badge. I don't want to know, right? Nothing wrong, per se, about technology unless it allows us to be slothful, not because it supposedly makes us lazier or do less. Technology usually makes us have to do far more. Far more. But if it makes us take a hit in the due diligence department, that's where things start to go wrong. Now, enough of bagging on people, mostly myself that I have in mind here. I want to draw for inspiration, both liturgical practice and just general practice in the history of the church, to talk about how we can learn to be more diligent. And so I like to bring, this is where I think alcohol in the Catholic Church actually usually has a really good lesson for us to think about. And so, friend, I want to bring up the winemaking country of Burgundy today. Okay, it's as simple as I know. Burgundy is synonymous with wine, red wine. I know Italians would be mad at that, but the French would be perfectly happy with it. Burgundy, the place in France where you just have this luscious land, ripe, no pun intended, for grapes to be made into red wine. And whenever we think of wine and we think of wine commercials, I always think about how they show Napa Valley in California, and it just has lovely green rolling hills, and wouldn't you want a vacation there? What's funny about this is even though the Romans in ancient times set out outposts in what was called Gaul, back then, this is before it was Burgundy or France, after Rome started to fall, the most vicious barbarians, save the Vandals, were the Burgundians. And the Burgundians were hardcore murdering pirates, essentially. And they were really good at it. They were harsh. They took no for an answer. They were Arians at first. They were sort of bought into becoming actually Catholics. They basically went back and forth between being allies of Rome and turning on Rome until Rome fell. And then they just started really setting about having all sorts of fun dynastic wars. And they've always been the most contentious part of France when it comes to their relationship to both Rome and Paris. But my, do they make good wine. And who do they leave the winemaking to? And this is what always blows people's mind, but monks. Monks they were the people who invented and purified and stored and kept the tradition of winemaking going. And so wine, which especially where I was from in Oklahoma, is synonymous with laxity and frivolity and Bacchus and all these ideas of intemperance, was actually the perfect image of diligence in a civilization that was falling apart. I've never made wine, but I've heard if grapes are any more finicky than wheat, I can only imagine how difficult it is to be a man who is pledged to pray 8 times a day and has all sorts of other things you have to worry about, but then also tends to vines, bottles them up, and makes the best sort of wine that France ever made to keep these long-standing traditions in tow. And it's even more baffling to think that they weren't doing this, the monks weren't doing this to throw parties at the end of the year. It's true that they were given an allowance of wine by St. Benedict, but they by no means drank most of the wine they made. They mostly sold it. It was a way for them to keep sustenance and actually buy the things they needed through, like I said, very often war-ravished periods throughout France. And the Benedictine monks of France were considered the supreme winemakers until the French Revolution, when they were suppressed and their lands were taken away and the government took over. And tradition says none of the wine has tasted as good since then, when they destroyed the old recipes for doing this. So wine, which I think a lot of us, not a lot of us, but a lot of people would associate with the very nature of sloth, in the hands of a monk, can be the very definition of diligence. And how is that the case? How is it the case that making something that doesn't seem to have an immediate benefit to their own lives would be diligent? And this is where we get the idea of how work not can be a sacrament, but like a sacramental. How is it that the work that we do every day can actually be a prayer to God? And so what I'd like to bring up is the feast that we celebrate today. We'll do a test here. Does anybody know what feast we're celebrating today? Go ahead.
Presentation of the Lord.
Presentation of the Lord.
Candlemas.
Candlemas. One more. Anybody know the other one? One more name for it. Purification of the Virgin Mary.
I thought that was 8 days.
Oh, no?
I thought that was 8 days.
Purification of the Virgin Mary?
After Easter, after Christmas.
No, it's today.
Is it?
And actually, in the monastic calendar, this sort of is the jump-off point towards Lent. So they already start reducing some of the things that they can do at this point. So purification, presentation of the Lord. Now, Candlemas, that's just something cool we do. Tomorrow we'll use it to bless throats on the Feast of St. Blaise. Anybody want to tell me what's weird about these two feasts? About what happened? Not even the feast. What's weird about what we're celebrating on the presentation of the Lord and the purification of the Virgin Mary? We'll start with the Virgin Mary. So the purification of the Virgin Mary, this is from, I think it's from Leviticus that they get this. All spilling of blood makes you ritually impure, whether you're fighting or whether you're a woman and you either menstruate or have a child. And so you have to actually stay away from the temple for a certain amount of time. Then you go to the temple and you do a purification ceremony, and you're allowed to go back in to the temple to worship. And the reason that this is done is because menstruation and childbirth and its difficulty are seen as a direct punishment for Eve. So it stems from our sinful nature. So a good question would be, why does the Virgin Mary need to go be purified? She's sinless. Let's leave that hanging. Anybody know what the presentation of the Lord is? What happened? Presentation of the Lord. Go ahead.
They took Jesus into the synagogue for the first time?
Well, the temple again.
To the temple, yeah.
And again, this is a Levitical rule. Every child born, because they're born in original sin, must be ransomed for the Lord. And so you take your child, and there's a sacrifice, an animal sacrifice that you have to make in order to have that child be made one with the family of Israel again. And yet again, I ask you, does Christ need to be presented and ransomed to the Lord? Both of these are frivolous in a way. Both of them are unnecessary actions for both the Virgin Mary and Christ. The reason that they're celebrated on the same day is since they didn't live in Jerusalem, they probably came and had both things happen at the same time. Now, why is this the case? Why do we celebrate? Not only why do we celebrate, but why did Jesus Christ allow himself to be presented at the temple? Why did the Virgin Mary allow herself to be purified? Why does Jesus get baptized? Why does Jesus do any of the things required of us sinners?
Demonstrate our humanity. Their humanity.
Right.
To be more human and divine.
For our sake. For our sake. Jesus Christ and Virgin Mary are the emblems of diligence. And the diligence that they do is not efficiency. And that's often what we think of when we think of the slothful people are inefficient, and the diligent get stuff done that needs to get done, and they wipe away the unnecessary things. And so, for instance, things like Mass or prayer, people want to say, okay, how often do I need to do them? How can I do them less? How can fathers speed up Mass? Let's get this stuff done. God himself in human flesh said, no problem, I'll go ahead and get something done that is really unnecessary for the sake of man. The Virgin Mary, who is perfect, says, for the sake of human beings, I will do something that is not necessary because I'm diligent. Because I'm diligent. It's not fanaticism that we have to try to figure out the most efficient way to get saved. And you think about that with God. God is not into efficiently saving any of us. If he was more efficient, you hear this from the prophets. Moses says, God, why did you choose us Jews? Surely there's a people that will make this easier on you. And God says, these are my people. God says, these are my people. Jesus Christ in the garden says, Lord, if there's a way that you can pass this cup, please let it be done. Isn't there surely a more efficient way to save our souls? I remember getting into arguments with young Baptist kids when I was in vacation Bible study. So they always go, why not at the beginning of time just raise the cross up, get this all finished with? It's like, come on, Jesus, what's your problem? Why all the intervening years? Why does Christ wait? Why hasn't Christ come back? There's so much suffering. Why is God so inefficient? It's not because God's inefficient, but that he's diligent. As yet again St. Benedict will say, we have to realize that every day that the world hasn't ended, and every day that we wake up and aren't dead, is God giving us one more chance to come back. One more chance to come back. We have to pray in thanksgiving every day that God is not efficient in the world's terms. That he's willing to let slothful people like us come to him. So if we look at ourselves and the myriad of ways that sloth sneaks up to us, we can look at winemaking monks and get a better understanding about what we might want to do, how we can work at something that does not immediately seem beneficial and improve our lives. And if the monks don't give us a poignant enough example, we can look to Jesus Christ and Mary on this feast day of February 2nd and say, if Jesus Christ was willing not only to go through all of the humiliations of being beaten and killed, but to even obey the law that didn't even apply to him, maybe the little things in life that would lead us towards ascetia or being workaholics or being slothful don't have to seem so scary. Now, one of the funny things that John Spirac does is he makes a quiz that you're supposed to take over each deadly sin, and to see if where you fall in terms of sloth. So I thought it would be fun to pass it out and quote unquote take the quiz. But on the back of this handout, he gives nice readings that if you're further interested, you can go give a look. So the quiz, he calls it trademark busting Cosmo style quiz. I don't know what the Cosmo Styles quiz. You don't have to tell me if you know what it is. So how do we figure out how to not be slothful, but not to be a fanatical, as he calls Thomas Edison workaholic either, or a unionized Belgian soldier on strike? So the quiz, he's basically saying, imagine that you're working at a charity. He says, let's just imagine you work at a homeless shelter. And you're doing this, and you're doing good. The projects seem nice. And you don't mind, like he says, missing your rounds of drunken miniature golf. But let's say you volunteer to help maintain a homeless shelter. You've already planted all the flowers that will fit, then gotten the lawn nice and spiffy. But now it's time to help with cleaning the bathrooms, something you only reluctantly do at home. When the nice lady in charge hands you the toilet brush, you react as follows. A, feel an overpowering heaviness that can only be answered by taking a long, much-needed nap. You start to total up how few hours you might have left on earth and wonder whether God really wants you to waste them cleaning up after strangers. And anyway, it doesn't matter because this is the limit. You're going home. The decision fills you with energy and hope. Or do you B, nod grimly and focus on all the spiritual benefit you can obtain by offering up your valuable time in such a grimly squalid cause? Imagine the purgatory you're burning off here. And remember all the dire warnings of holy souls who appeared to solitary, malnourished nuns to report that purgatory is only a little better than hell. Compared to that, hobo toilets are child's play. C, shudder and remind yourself of Dostoevsky's dictum, love in action is a harsh and dreadful thing compared to love in dreams. If you feel a little resentful, even humiliated, you try to remember occasions when you were praised beyond your merits and chuckle as you think of this as a balancing out of scales. And then D, squelch, cauterize, and crush your natural feeling of repugnance and wonder whether it wasn't sinful pride that made you feel it. That must be why God has chosen to humiliate you. You're a sinner who always returns like a dog to its vomit, so why shouldn't he send you to the toilets? Afraid your proud spirit will try to shirk this part of your necessary purgation, you volunteer to do more of the vilest duties around the shelter and promise yourself that by sheer force of will, you won't burn out and drop out the project or drown yourself in the toilet. So here are the results. If you picked A, man up, even if you're a woman, he's not PC, and clean those toilets. The monks who diagnose this deadly sin say that sloth can only be conquered by blundering straight through one's tasks, however intolerable it seems. So try to make it that the toilets that you're working on will be the cleanest ones in history. If you picked B, the only reason you can think of helping desperate people is to lighten your sentence on Judgment Day, that's better than nothing, but like going to confession just once a year. But the more tasks you think of this way, the harder you'll find them to do, and the less joy you'll find in this existence. Remember this, if God really meant earthly life to feel like taking the SATs, then why are we so reluctant to admit when our time's up and turn in our booklets? If you pick C, your attitude doesn't need adjusting and good for you. Now don't give the credit to your naturally upbeat personality or the wisdom and goodness you obtain. It's grace, which you got for free, so it's bad taste to boast about it, especially in peppy little emails you send to your inertful friends, which only depresses them. And if you pick D, you probably need to find some other project, one that doesn't provoke you to such exhausting and unsustainable extremes. The frenzy of self-laceration you're starting to feel has a technical name in Catholic theology. It's called a scruple, and it leads to despair. If you decide to continue at the shelter, remember that each of these homeless folks is an image of God, and so are you. He isn't trying to grind you into mush so he can reshape you into a cosmic ashtray. There's a spirit who does that all right. He's called the accuser, but he plays for the other team. So to wrap this up, the reason I like John's Mirror is I think that it is very often the case that we look at either the virtue and then all the ways when we start to fail, we think that there's something innately wrong with us, instead of realizing that there's very fundamental ways we're all prone to go. But it's also important to realize the wide variety of ways that we might miss the mark. Aristotle always said the good can only be accomplished one way, but there's many ways to be bad. And you start to see that every time we mess up, it's our own unique failure. But every time we do something right, we begin to really look like Christ. That's the image and the bullseye that we're all shooting for. And so, yes, he gives it as a flippant little quiz that you're supposed to take at the end of the day. But if we try to focus on the median and not go for just sloth or fanaticism, but think about what diligence really is, or any of these, hopefully this can begin and we can learn to not only have a better image of ourselves, but probably learn to laugh a little at ourselves too. So at any rate, thank you for coming today. Is there any other questions over anything we were going over? If not, I want you to enjoy the day. Probably not go jogging, it seems like.
At least not around your neighborhood.
Not around my neighborhood. No one else notices the sheer amount of people that jog?
Oh, yeah. I do.
Just rampant.
The PE teacher of all people and I that I used to work with used to comment, have you noticed a few of them are smiling?
Well, I always love when people will say that like school is hard or the faith is hard, but I'm like, you're all really proud like how long you've ran. They'll like share like, yeah, look, I broke my toe running a marathon. And I'm like, oh, do you want to come early to Mass and pray a rosary? No, that's hard. I'm like, I think the jogging's hard. I don't know the last time I've jogged. I think I've jogged because someone was closing a restaurant and I wanted to eat. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, work to do.
Yeah. Think about how you're saying you're trying to sit in front of the pew.
No.
You're trapped.
Yes.
Thank you.